The Scarecrow and his Servant, Day 1, Chapter 1, Lightning. One day, old Mr. Pandolfo, who hadn't been feeling at all well, decided that it was time to make a scarecrow. The birds had been very troublesome. Come to that, his rheumatism had been troublesome, and the soldiers had been troublesome, and the weather had been troublesome, and his cousins had been troublesome. It was all getting a bit too much for him. Even his old pet raven had flown away. He couldn't do anything about his rheumatism, or the soldiers, or the weather, or his cousins, who were the biggest problem of all. There was a whole family of them, the Buffalonis, and they wanted to get hold of his land and divert all the springs and streams and drain all the wells and put up a factory to make a weed killer and rat poison and insecticide. All those troubles were too big for old Mr. Pandolfo to manage, but he thought he could do something about the birds, at least. So he put together a fine-looking scarecrow with a big solid turnip for a head and a sturdy broomstick for a backbone, and dressed him in his old tweed suit and stuffed him lightly with straw. Then he tucked a short letter inside him, wrapped in oilskin for safety to show where he belonged. There you are, he said. Now you remember what your job is, and remember where you belong. Be courteous, and be brave, and be honorable, and be kind, and the best of blooming luck. He stuck the scarecrow into the middle of the wheat field and went home to lie down because he wasn't feeling well at all. That night, another farmer came along and stole the scarecrow, being too lazy to make one himself. And the next night, someone else came along and stole him again. So little by little, the scarecrow moved away from the place where he was made, and he got more and more tattered and torn, and finally he didn't look nearly as smart as he had when Mr. Pandolfo put him together. He stood in the middle of a muddy field, and he stayed there. But one night there was a thunderstorm. It was a very violent one, and everyone in the district shivered and trembled and jumped as the thunder went off like a cannon fire, and lightning lashed down like whips. The scarecrow stood there in the wind and rain, taking no notice. And so he might have stayed, but then there was one of those 1,000,000 to 1 chances that are like winning the lottery. All his molecules and atoms and elementary particles and whatnot were lined up in exactly the right way to switch on when the lightning struck him, which it did at 2 in the morning, fizzing its way through his turnip and down his broomstick and into the mud. The scarecrow blinked with surprise and looked all around. There wasn't much to see except a field of mud, and not much light to see it by except the flashes of lightning. Still, there wasn't a bird in sight. "Excellent," said the scarecrow. On the same night, a small boy called Jack happened to be sheltering in a barn not far away. The thunder was so loud that it woke him out of his sleep with a jump. At first he thought it was a cannon fire, and he sat up terrified with his eyes wide open. He could think of nothing worse than soldiers and guns. If it weren't for the soldiers, he'd still have a family and a home and a bed to sleep in. But as he sat there with his heart thumping, he heard the downpour of the rain on the roof and realized that the bang had only been thunder and not gunfire. He gave a sigh of relief and lay down again, shivering and sneezing and turning over and over in the hay trying to get warm, until finally he fell asleep. By the morning, the sun had cleared away, and the sky was a bright, cold blue. Jack woke up again, feeling colder than ever and hungry too. But he knew how to look for food, and before long, he gathered up some grains of wheat and a couple of turnip tops and a limp carrot, and he sat down in the doorway of the barn in the sunlight to eat them. "Could be worse," he said to himself. He ate very slowly to make it last, and then he just sat there getting warm. Someone would come along soon to chase him away, but for the moment he was safe. Then he heard a voice calling from across the fields. Jack was curious, so he stood up and shaded his eyes to look. The shouting came from somewhere in the field beyond the road, and since he had nothing else to do, he stood up and walked along toward it. The shouts came from a scarecrow in the middle of the muddiest field in sight, and he was waving his arms wildly and yelling at the top of his voice and leaning over at a crazy angle. "Help!" he was shouting. "Come and help me!" "I think I'm going mad," said Jack to himself. "Still, look at that poor old thing. I'll go and help him anyway. He looks madder than I feel." So he stepped onto the muddy field and struggled out to the middle where the scarecrow was waiting. To tell the truth, Jack felt a little nervous because it isn't every day you find a scarecrow talking to you. "Now tell me, young man," said the scarecrow as soon as Jack was close enough to hear, "are there any birds around? Any crows, for example? I can't see behind me. Are they hiding?" His voice was rich and sonorous. His head was made of a great knobbly turnip, with a broad crack for a mouth, and a long thin sprout for a nose, and 2 bright little stones for eyes. He had a tattered straw hat, now badly singed, a soggy woolen scarf, and an old tweed jacket full of holes, and his right candle arms had gloves stuffed with straw on the ends of them, one glove leather and the other wool. He also had a pair of threadbare trousers, but since he only had one leg, the empty trouser leg trailed down beside him. Everything was the color of mud. Jack scratched his head and looked all around. "No," he said, "no crows anywhere, no birds at all." "That's a good job done," said the scarecrow. "Now I want to move on, but I need another leg. If you go and find me a leg, I shall be very obliged. Just like this one, only the opposite," he added, lifting his trouser leg daintily to show a stout stick set firmly in the earth. "All right," said Jack, "I can do that." So he set off toward the wood at the edge of the field and clambered through the undergrowth looking for the right sort of stick. He found one before long and took it back to the Scarecrow. "Let me see," said the Scarecrow. "Hold it up beside me. That's it. Now slide it up inside the leg of my trousers." The end of the stick was broken and splintered, and it wasn't easy to push it up the soggy, muddy trouser leg, but Jack finally got it all the way up, and then he jumped, because he felt it twitch in his hand. He let go, and the new leg swung itself down beside the other. But as soon as the Scarecrow tried to move, the new foot became stuck like the first one. The harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. Finally, he stopped and looked back at Jack. It was astonishing how much expression he could manage with his gashed mouth and stone eyes. "Young man," he said, "I have a proposition to make. Here you are, an honest and willing youth, and here I am, a Scarecrow of enterprise and talent. What would you say if I offered you the position of my personal servant?" "What would my duties be?" said Jack. "To accompany me throughout the world, to fetch and carry, to wash, cook, and attend my needs. In return, I have nothing to offer but excitement and glory. We might sometimes go hungry, but we shall never want for adventure. Well, my boy, what do you say?" "I'll do it," said Jack. "I've got nothing else to do except starve, and nowhere to live except ditches and empty barns. So I might as well have a job. And thank you, Mr. Scarecrow. I'll take it." The Scarecrow extended his hand, and Jack shook it warmly. "Your first job is to get me out of this mud," said the Scarecrow. So Jack heaved the Scarecrow's 2 legs out of the mud and carried him to the road. He hardly weighed anything at all. "Which way shall we go?" said Jack. They looked both ways. In one direction there was a forest, and in the other there was a line of hills. There was no one in sight. "That way," said the Scarecrow, pointing to the hills. So they set off with the sun on their backs and the green hills ahead. In a farmhouse not far behind them, a lawyer was explaining something to a farmer. "My name is Scarecrow," he said. "I specialize in finding things for my employers, the distinguished and highly respected Buffaloini Corporation of Bella Fontana. The farmer gasped. He was a stout, red-faced, idle character, and he was afraid of this lean and silky lawyer who was dressed entirely in black. "Oh, the Buffaloinis?" "Yes, indeed, Mr. Scarecrow," he said. "What can I do to help? Anything? Just name it." "It's a small matter," said the lawyer, "but one of the sentimental importance to my clients. It concerns a scarecrow. It was made by a distant cousin of the chairman of the corporation, and it seems to have vanished from its place of origin. My client, Mr. Luigi Buffaloini, is a very warm-hearted and family-minded man, and he would like to restore the Scarecrow to its original home in memory of his dear cousin who made it." The lawyer looked through some papers, and the farmer ran his finger around the inside of his shirt collar and gulped. "Well, he said faintly. "One might almost think that scarecrows had the power of movement," said Mr. Scarecrow. Smiling in a sinister way, "The fellow has been wandering. I've traced him through several farms already, and now I discover that he has made his way to yours." I think I know the Scarecrow you mentioned," said the farmer. I bought him from someone else. You didn't need him no more. Or who didn't need him no more? Oh, good. May we go and see if he is the right one?" "Well, of course. I'd do anything for the Buffaloinis, important people. Wouldn't want to upset them, but, well, he's gone." "Gone? Again?" said the lawyer, narrowing his eyes. "I went out this morning to tidy him up a bit, and he wasn't there. Mind you, there was a big storm last night. He might have blown away." "Oh, dear. This is very unfortunate. Mr. Buffaloini takes a dim view of people who do not look after his property. I think I can say that his degree of disappointment will be considerable." The farmer was quaking with alarm. "If I ever hear anything about the Scarecrow," he said, "anything at all, I'll report it to you at once." "I think that would be very wise," said Mr. Scarecrow. "Here's my card. Now, show me the field from which the Scarecrow vanished." Chapter 2. Brigands. The Scarecrow and his servants set a good pace as they walked along. On the way, they passed a field of cabbages, in the middle of which stood another Scarecrow, but he was a mournful-looking fellow whose arms dropped feebly at his side. "Good day to you, sir," called the Scarecrow, waving to him cheerfully. But the Scarecrow in the field took no notice. "You see," the Scarecrow explained to Jack, "there's a man whose mind is on his job. He's concentrating hard. Quite right." "Nice-looking cabbages," said Jack. He left the cabbages reluctantly and ran to catch up with the Scarecrow, who was striding ahead like a champion. Presently, they found the road getting steeper and the fields getting rockier, and finally there were no fields at all, and the road was only a track. It was very hot. "Unless we find something to eat and drink very soon," said Jack, "I'm going to snuff it." "Well, we'll find something," said the Scarecrow, patting him on the shoulder. "I have every confidence in you. Besides, we understand springs and streams and wells where I come from, fountains, too. You take it from me, we'll find a spring before long." They walked on, and the Scarecrow pointed out curious features of geology, such as a rock that looked like a pigeon, and in botany, such as a bush with a robin's nest in it, and entomology, such as a beetle that was as black as a crow. You know a lot about birds, Master, said Jack. I've made them my lifetime study, my boy. I do believe I could scare any bird that ever lived. I bet you could. Oh, listen, what's that? It was the sound of someone crying, and it came from around the corner. Jack and the Scarecrow hurried on and found an old woman sitting at a crossroads with a basket of provisions all scattered on the ground. She was weeping and wailing at the top of her voice. Madame, the Scarecrow said, raising his straw hat very politely, what wicked bird has done this to you? The old woman looked up and gave a great gulp of astonishment. Her mouth opened and shut several times, but not a sound came out. Finally, she struggled to her feet and curtsied nervously. It was the brigands, she said, begging your pardon, my lord. There's a gang of terrible brigands living in these hills, robbing travelers and making a life of misery for us poor people. And they just came galloping past and knocked me over and rode away laughing. The cowardly rogues. The Scarecrow was amazed. Do you mean to say that this was the work of human beings? He said. Indeed, yes, your honor, said the old woman. Jack, my boy, tell me it's not so. Jack was gathering up the little things that had fallen out of her basket, apples, carrots, a lump of cheese, a loaf of bread. It was very difficult to do it without dribbling. I'm afraid it is, master, said Jack. There's a lot of wicked people about. Tell you what, let's turn around and go the other way. Not a bit of it, said the Scarecrow sternly. We're going to teach these villains a lesson. How dare they treat a lady in this disgraceful way? Here, madame, take my arm. He was so courteous to the old woman, and his manner was so graceful that she very soon forgot his knobbly turn-up face and his rough wooden arms and talked to him as if he were a proper gentleman. Yes, sir. Ever since the wars began, first the soldiers came through and took everything, and then the brigands came along, robbing and murdering and taking what they wanted, and they say the chief brigand is related to the Buffalinis, so they've got political protection too. We don't know where to turn. Buffalinis, you say? I don't like the sound of them. What are they? A very powerful family, sir. We don't dare cross the Buffalinis. Well, fear no more, said the Scarecrow resolutely. We shall scare the brigands away, and they'll never trouble you again. Nice-looking apples, said Jack hopefully, handing the old woman her basket. Oh, they are, she said. Tasty-looking bread, too. Yes, it is, said the old woman, tucking it firmly under her arm. Lovely-looking cheese. Yes, I like a piece of cheese. Goes down a treat with a drop of beer. You haven't got any beer, have you? Said Jack, looking around. No, she said. Well, I'll be on my way. Thank you, sir, she said, curtsying again to the Scarecrow, who raised his hat and bowed. And off she went. Jack sighed and followed the Scarecrow, who was already starting off toward the top of the hill. When they reached the top, they saw a ruined castle. There was one tower that was still standing and some walls and battlements, but everything else had tumbled down and was covered in ivy. What a spooky place, said Jack. I wouldn't like to go near it at night. Courage, Jack, said the Scarecrow. Look, there's a spring. What did I tell you? Drink your fill, my boy. It was true. The spring bubbled out of the rocks and beside the castle and flowed into a little pool. And as soon as he saw it, Jack gave a cry of delight and plunged his face deep into the icy water, swallowing and swallowing until he wasn't thirsty any more. Finally, he emerged and heard the Scarecrow calling, Jack, Jack, in here, look! Jack ran through the doorway at the foot of the tower and found the Scarecrow looking around at all kinds of things. In one corner, barrels of gunpowder, muskets, swords, and daggers, and pikes. In another corner, chests and boxes of gold coins and silver chains and glittering jewels of every color. And in a third corner, food, cried Jack. There were great smoked hams hanging from the ceiling, cheeses as big as cartwheels, onions and strings, boxes of apples, pies of every kind, bread, biscuits, and spice cakes and fruit cakes and butter cakes and honey cakes in abundance. It was no good even trying to resist. Jack seized the pie as big as his own head, and a moment later he was sitting in the middle of the food, chewing away merrily, while the Scarecrow watched in satisfaction. What a stroke of luck finding this, he said, and no one knows about it at all. If only that old lady knew about it, she could come and help herself, and she wouldn't be poor any more. Well, said Jack, swallowing a mouthful of pie and picking up a spice cake, it's not quite like that, master. I bet all this belongs to the brigands, and we'd better clear off soon, because if they catch us, they'll cut our throats. But I haven't got a throat. Well, I have, and I don't want it cut, said Jack. Look, we can't stay here. Let's grab some of the food and scram. Shame on you, said the Scarecrow sternly. Where's your courage? Where's your honor? We're going to scare these brigands away and scare them so badly that they'll never come back. I wouldn't be surprised if we won a grand reward. Why, they might even make me a duke, or give me a gold medal. No, it wouldn't surprise me a bit. Well, said Jack, maybe. Suddenly the Scarecrow pointed at a heap of straw. Oh, look, what's that? He said. There was something moving, a little creature the size of a mouse, was crawling feebly around in a heap of straw on the floor. They both bent over to look at it. "It's a baby bird," said Jack. "It's an owl chick, that's what it is," said the Scarecrow severely. "These parents have no sense of responsibility. Look at that nest up there. Downright dangerous." He pointed to an untidy bundle of twigs in a crack high up in the wall. "Well, there's only one thing for it," he said. "You keep guard, Jack, while I return this infant to his cradle." "But," Jack tried to protest. The Scarecrow took no notice. He bent over and picked up the little bird and tucked it tenderly into his pocket, making gentle clucking noises to soothe it. Then he began to clamber perilously up the sheer face of the wall, jamming his hands and feet into the cracks. "Master, take care," called Jack in a fever of anxiety. "If you fall down, you'll snap like a dry stick." The Scarecrow didn't listen, because he was concentrating hard. Jack scampered to the door and looked around. Darkness was gathering, but there was no sign of any brigands. He scampered back in the inn and saw the Scarecrow high up and clinging to the wall with one hand while fumbling in his pocket with the other, then reaching up and carefully putting the little bird back into the nest. "Now you sit still," he said sternly. "No more squirming, you understand? If you can't fly, don't squirm. When I see your parents, I shall have a word with them." Then he began to clamber back down the wall. It looked so dangerous that Jack hardly dared to watch, but finally the Scarecrow reached the floor again and brushed his hands firmly. "I thought the birds were your enemy, Master," said Jack. "Not the children, Jack. Good gracious me. Any man of honor would sooner bite off his own leg than hurt a child. Heaven forfend." "Blimey," said Jack. While the Scarecrow pottered about in the ruins, looking at everything with great curiosity, Jack gathered up a couple of pies, a loaf of bread, and a half-dozen apples, and put them in a leather bag he found hanging on a hook next to the muskets. He hid it among the ivy growing over the tumbled wall outside. The sun had set by this time, and it was nearly dark. Jack sat on the stones and thought about brigands. What did they do to people they caught? They weren't like scarecrows or men of honor. They were more like soldiers, probably. They were bound to do horrible things, like tying you up and cutting bits if you were dangling over a fire, or putting earwigs up your nose. They might take all your ribs out. They might cram your trousers full of fireworks. They might... Someone tapped him on the shoulder, and Jack leapt up with a yell. "My word," said the Scarecrow admiringly. "That's a fine noise. I was just going to tell you that the brigands are coming." "What?" said Jack in terror. Come, said the Scarecrow. "It's only a small flock, and no more than 20, I'd say. And I've got a plan. Let's hear it, quick." "Very well, here it is. We'll hide in the castle until they're all inside, and then we'll scare them. And then they'll run away. How's that?" Jack was speechless. The Scarecrow beamed. "Come along," he said. "I found an excellent place to hide." Helplessly, Jack followed his master back into the tower and looked all around in the dimness. "Where's this excellent place to hide?" he said. "Why, over there," said the Scarecrow, pointing to a corner of the room in plain sight. "They'll never think of looking there." But, Jack could already hear the clop of horses' hooves outside. He scrunched himself down in the corner beside the Scarecrow and squeezed his knees together to stop them knocking, and put his hands over his eyes so that no one could see him, and waited for the brigands to come in. Chapter 3. A Story by the Fireside. They were a disciplined band, those brigands. Jack watched between his fingers as they came in silently and sat around the fireplace. The chief brigand was a ferocious-looking man with 2 belts full of bullets crisscrossed over his shoulders, another one round his waist, a cutlass, 2 pistols, and 3 daggers, one in his belt, another strapped to his arm, and the third in the top of his boot. What's more, if he lost all his weapons, he could still stab 2 people with his mustache, which was waxed into long points as sharp as a pin. His eyes glared and rolled as he looked around at his men, and Jack was almost sure they gave out sparks. Any second now he'll see us, Jack thought. So it was despair as much as bravado that made him stand up and say, "Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to my master's castle." And he swept a low bow. When he stood up, he saw 20 swords and 20 pistols all pointing at him, and 20 pairs of eyes, each eye just like the end of a pistol barrel. The chief brigand roared. "Who's this?" "It's a mad boy, Captain," said one of the men. "Shall we roast him?" "No," said the chief, coming close and touching Jack's ribs with the point of his sword. "There's no meat on him. He's all bone and gristle. He might flavor a stew, I suppose. Turn around, boy." Jack turned around, and then turned back again. The chief brigand was shaking his head doubtfully. "You say this is your master's castle?" he said. "Indeed it is, sir, and you're most welcome," said Jack. "And who's your master?" "My lord Scarecrow," said Jack, pointing to the Scarecrow in the corner, who was lying propped against the wall as still as a turnip. A suit of old clothes and a few sticks could lie. The chief brigand roared with laughter, and all his well-trained band slapped their thighs and held their sides and bellowed with mirth. "He is mad," cried the chief brigand. "He's lost his wits." "Indeed I have, sir," said Jack. "I've been looking for them for months." What do mad boys taste like?" said one of the brigands. "Do they taste different from normal ones?" "Spicier," said another. "More of a peppery taste." "No," said the chief. "We won't eat him. We'll keep him as a pet. We'll teach him to do tricks. Here, mad boy, turn a somersault. Go on." Jack turned a somersault and stood up again. "He's quick, isn't he?" said one brigand. "Bet he can't dance, though," said another. "Mad boy," roared the chief. "Dance!" Jack obediently capered like a monkey. Then he capered like a frog, and then he capered like a goat. The brigands were in a good mood by now, and they roared with laughter and clapped their hands. "Wine!" bellowed the chief. "Mad boy, stop dancing and pour us some wine." Jack found a big flagon of wine and went round the circle of brigands, filling up the horn cups they were all holding out. "A toast," the chief brigand said. "To plunder." "To plunder," the brigands shouted and drank the wine in one gulp, so Jack had to go all the way around and fill the cups again. Meanwhile, some of the brigands were lighting a fire and cutting up great joints of meat. Jack looked at the meat uneasily, but it looked like proper beef, and it certainly smelled good when it started to cook. While it was roasting, the chief brigand counted out the jewels and gold they'd plundered, and divided it all into 20 heaps, one big one and 19 little ones. And as he was doing that, he said, "Here, mad boy, tell us a story." Well, that was a hard one for Jack. However, if he didn't do it, there'd be big trouble, so he sat down and began. "Once upon a time," he said, "there was a band of brigands living in a cave. They were cruel and wicked. Oh, you could never imagine such terrible men. Every one of them was a qualified murderer. Anyway, one day they fell to the quarreling among themselves, and before they knew it, one of them lay dead on the floor of the cave. So the chief said, "Take him out and bury him. He makes the place look untidy." And they picked the dead man up and took him outside and dug a hole for him, and they put him in and shoveled the earth back on top. But he kept throwing it out. "You're not burying me," he said, and he climbed out of the grave. "Oh, yes, we are," they said, and they tried to shove him back in, but he wouldn't go. Every time they got him in the grave, he climbed out again, and he was as dead as a doornail. Finally, they got him in, and 7 of them sat on him, while the others piled rocks on top, and that did it. "He won't get out of that," said the chief, and they went back in the cave and lit a fire to make a supper. They had a big meal and lots of wine, and then they lay down to sleep. But in the middle of the night, one of the brigands woke up. The cave was all silent, and the moonlight was shining in through the entrance. What woke him up was a sound, like a rock moving quietly on another rock. Not loud at all, just a quiet sort of scraping noise. This man lay there with his eyes wide open, just listening as hard as he could. Then he heard it again. All the brigands were sitting stock still, and they gazed fearfully at Jack with wide eyes. "Help," he thought. "What am I going to say next?" But he didn't have to say anything, because into the silence there came a little scraping sound, like a rock moving quietly on another rock. All the brigands jumped, and they all gave a little squeak of terror. And then, said Jack, he saw. "Look, look!" And he pointed dramatically to the corner where the Scarecrow was lying. Every head turned round at once. The Scarecrow slowly lifted his head and stared at them with his knobbly turnip face. All the brigands gasped, including the chief. And the Scarecrow stretched out his arms and bent his legs and stood up and took one step toward them. And every single brigand leapt to his feet and fled, screaming with terror. They fell over. They knocked one another out of the way. The ones that fell over got trampled on, and the ones that trampled on them got their feet caught and fell over on themselves to be trampled on in their turn. And some of them fell into the fire and leapt up squealing with pain, and that scattered the burning logs so that the cave was dark, and that made them even more frightened. So they shrieked and yelled in mortal fear, and those who could still see a little saw the Scarecrow's great knobbly face coming toward them and scrambled even harder to get away. And no more than 10 seconds later, the brigands were all running away down the road, screaming with terror. Jack stood in the doorway in amazement, watching them disappear into the distance. "Well, master," he said, "it happened, just as you said it would."